All right, well, we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Amy O'Hara. I'm the president of the Association of Public Data Users, and I want to thank you for joining us today for the latest in our Demystifying Data Privacy series. So, as you know, we've been doing work to try and break down communication silos to help people understand aspects of data privacy that they might not think about every day. And today I am delighted to introduce Melissa Brown, who is the Senior Research Project Manager at the Black Researchers Collective, or BRC for short. Melissa is going to present today and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so please type your questions into the chat as we go along. Melissa, I think that everyone in our audience is interested to learn more about the data privacy listening sessions that you guys completed earlier this year. And I know that BRC takes a decolonizing approach to the work, and you're able to uplift community perspective in a way that standard polling or even surveys can't do. Could you please tell our audience a bit about your work?
Sure, absolutely. I want to thank everyone again for being here. And today's APDU's presentation will focus on a joint partnership and initiative that focused on capturing, elevating, and centering the voices of community residents on the issues of data privacy and what communities want policymakers and data leaders to understand. Um, and again, as Amy noted, my name is Melissa Brown. I'm the Senior Research Project Manager at the BRC. And the BRC is a Black woman-led organization that was founded in Chicago in 2019. And our mission is to advance racial equity by equipping communities with the research tools so that they can be civically engaged and policy informed. And we do this work through four pillars of work. Um, our first pillar seeks to empower Black communities on the south and west sides of Chicago to lead, design, and implement community participatory action research through a three-step process. And that is a community pitch process, a virtual community coffee chat series, and a cohort-based community workshop intensive that culminates in a paid community action research project. And the entire Pillar One programming model lasts for roughly about 3 months, give or take. Our second pillar, our research, education, and technical assistance, or our READA pillar, which I lead with my colleague, Sona, is our fee-for-service line. And that's where Sona and I consult, train, and support organizations, community organizers, and leaders in Chicago, regionally and nationally, who are interested in conducting community engaged research, evaluating their programs, initiatives, or enhancing their team's capacity to understand data and activate around their findings through a decolonizing lens. And all of our reader projects that we take on share the common goal of improving Black lives and Black communities. And our third pillar, which is our grassroots strategy, we utilize our Research to the Street podcast, which is currently available on all major platforms, to discuss with viewers about the different grassroots strategies they can use to elevate and amplify the importance of and power of research and the data related to policy related relevant work. And in this pillar, we also house our free toolkits that are available on our BRC websites. And it teaches community how to conduct these coffee chats or kind of listening sessions in community for community organizations, for individuals and smaller nonprofits. And then on our last pillar, our Black Researchers Pipeline, we have our Black Researchers app that connects Black researchers locally in Chicago and nationwide with workforce opportunities and local campaigns that they can be a part of. So kind of think of it as like a LinkedIn kind of app sort of premise. And all of our work, again, is done through a decolonizing lens, meaning that BRC's model is intentionally designed as a decolonial, I can talk today, intervention that addresses the long history of extractive research that has targeted Black and Brown communities where people of color, especially Black people, have been treated as subjects rather than co-producers of knowledge. And we work through the BRC in our work to shift that power, both the power and the narrative that is often held that the lived experiences of people of color don't matter or they hold little value. Our decolonizing research basically puts community and the people who live in them at the center of our work. And for our partners, together, BRC, APDU partnered with two other organizations earlier this spring, the Leadership Conference Education Fund and Georgetown Massive Data Institutes, or MDI, on this project. And up until recently, all four of our organizations were working kind of individually and now kind of collectively to fight to protect and educate regular citizens about their data, the disappearance of their data as a result of the kind of current administration's policies, and to help inform positive policy change around this issue. Current policies on data use and data privacy are rapidly changing, and there's a vast array of invested stakeholders, including tech experts, data advocates, data system managers, policymakers, legislators, and countless others who wear important hats and who are both proponents of and are raising concerns about the current status of data use, data privacy, and data loss. However, these conversations are often happening in silos, and people are speaking different language. You know, there's legalese versus kind of the research language versus the tech language versus the policy language or verbiage that the others do not understand. So we're kind of talking over each other, not necessarily to each other, in a way that that people can understand, let alone, ordinary citizens like, our grandmother, our aunt, our uncles, our children. Um, this frequently has caused misunderstanding, the use and lack thereof of a common language, and the creation of policies and passages of policies that don't resonate or reflect the issues, the priorities, or concerns of everyday citizens. And these are, unfortunately, are missed opportunities for communication and inclusion of everyone. However, APDUs, platforms like this APDU webinar, and the findings from our Community Voice Listening Session project, for example, seek to inform broader cross-sector dialogues and contribute to APDU's effort to shape an emerging policy agenda that addresses current and emerging threats to data privacy. And this includes expanded federal data sharing and increased disclosure risks. Ultimately, APDU, BRC, and our partners are interested in ensuring that the voices and experiences of individuals and communities are heard and reflected in policy discussions. So the gap that we're addressing, participants that participated in our listening sessions were predominantly African American and women, a key community that is served by the Black Researchers Collective. And while African American women have historically served as critical and early indicators of how policies and systems affect broader communities, often because they bear or we bear the disproportionate impact when protections are inadequate. The insights offered in today's presentations are important consideration for policymakers who are interested in understanding how emerging data privacy policies may affect communities that are often most vulnerable to surveillance, discrimination, and systemic inequities. So rather than being viewed as a limitation in the validity of the forthcoming findings, the findings provided here are important because they share insights into how data privacy and issues are understood, experienced, and navigated by community members in their everyday lives. And this project intentionally flips the dynamic by engaging and lifting the voice, the concerns, and recommendations of community with the goal of reducing skepticism, distrust amongst community, and instead educate, inform, and empowering individuals. So why does community voice matter for data governance? BRC believes that that individuals, especially those who are Black and Brown, are experts in our own lived experience. And currently, a lot of people have real reasons to be skeptical about how their data is being collected and used. And through the listening sessions, we sought to capture varying insights and perspectives about how Chicagoans understood their relationship with data, what they give up freely for convenience versus how to shape better laws and protections around how their data is being used with the goal of helping to inform broader policy conversations, to elevate community perspectives, concerns, risks, and recommendations around how they would like their legislators, policymakers, and tech companies to better secure and protect their data, and what accountability for those stewards should look like related to their data. So how did we come about generating this community evidence? Again, as I mentioned earlier, BRC was approached by the Leadership Conference Fund, Georgetown MDI, and APDU to design and then facilitate 2 community listening sessions with residents across Chicago. We had a total of 21 participants that participated in 2 separate 90-minute in-person listening sessions, and they were compensated for their time. Our listening sessions were comprised of individuals who range in age from 18 to 65 and older. 81% of our respondents identified as cisgender women, and 81% were African American. 10% identified as Hispanic, while the remaining participants identified as either Asian or white. And we had representation from all across Chicago, as well as the Chicago suburbs. And we utilized a mixed method approach to capture community perspective on data privacy risks, safeguards, and policy priorities. The sessions were recorded with consent and transcribed for thematic analysis. And participants were asked to provide or elaborate on what they thought would be appropriate policy changes and recommendations they'd like to see their local, state, or national elected officials take into consideration or implement. So let's get into some of the findings, right? So community perceived benefits of data sharing. Participants generally view data sharing as acceptable when it directly improved their access to services, opportunities, or personal convenience. Examples of this included applying for jobs, enrolling in school, completing tax filings, accessing healthcare, transferring benefits, completing background checks, and then kind of using the different travel programs such as Global Entry. These were examples that generated or elevated out of these conversations. Participants often describe the access and use of these services as necessary exchanges when they were sharing their personal information. It was deemed worthy of it or deemed worth it to provide that information because it directly benefited them or their family, or because it saved them time or allowed them to receive different services. Participants were most supportive of data sharing when it contributed to health, safety, or their personal well-beings. Several participants cited sharing their medical information among healthcare providers using the different patient portals, while others reported they participated in health-related studies or had their information shared, for medical emergencies. And these served as examples of situations where the benefits of sharing their data for the purpose of improving their safety and health outcomes or the quality of their quality of life heavily outweighed their privacy concerns. However, people feel that consent is coerced rather than meaningful. Participants acknowledge routinely feeling pressured to accept terms and agreements and share data without understanding how it will be used. They acknowledge routinely clicking agree on terms and conditions, accepting cookies, or signing up for apps without actually reading the privacy notices. They also commented that their digital participation has been normalized and exhausting. However, some expressed resignation that their data is already everywhere, even while recognizing the risks involved with sharing it. Participants felt that many forms of data collection they cannot meaningfully avoid. And examples of this included surveillance cameras in stores and public transit, the tollways, license plate scanners, work and school systems, healthcare requirements, the airport screenings, government applications, and public and private space monitoring. So like the Ring cameras came up in quite a few conversations that people have, in around their homes, on their blocks and things. Participants describe these systems as forced participation, where data sharing is also tied to access to basic services or navigating public life. And they were acutely aware of and concerned about the constant and automatic collection of their data and the current process of sharing it with police and with ICE. Participants viewed the benefits of digitization and convenience, such as tap to pay, delivery, apps, auto refill, subscriptions as beneficial, but also they saw those as less, more risky and less secure. They reported that they valued the current speed and ease of accessing and using these different digital systems. And using like Alexa and Siri to save time, to make things more efficient, or to expedite checkout processes online. At the same time, some participants repeatedly describe these digital systems as both a gift and a curse, and question at what cost this convenience come with, particularly when nearly everything has moved to an online platform. And this has increased opportunities for hacking, surveillance, identity theft, and the possibility of unauthorized sharing. And this is exacerbated because many apps and phones themselves that people use daily automatically save their data, track their behavior, or make opting out of its collection very difficult. For several respondents, they do not fully understand what they are agreeing to, how their information will be reused, regardless of if these terms are provided to them via their phone, online, in store. you know, they still don't understand. Oh. People have major concerns about the government's misuse and the potential harm that comes with the sharing of their data. Health records, information about their sexuality, their citizenship, their visa status, race, ethnicity, where they live, their marital status, and disability information were all viewed as especially vulnerable categories of data, according to multiple participants that we spoke with. They worried that this data, if it was mishandled, could affect their immigration outcomes, or that of their loved ones. It could impact their access to getting healthcare treatments. It could increase their insurance costs, policing, employment opportunities, or more broadly speaking, how Black and Brown communities are represented and then treated. Moreover, several participants also worry that current algorithms could use and manipulate their own data, or even that of vulnerable populations, such as minors, elders, the undocumented, those who may be undocumented, when it comes to their purchasing decisions, shaping their beliefs, reinforcing ideological bubbles, or influencing broader political behavior without their awareness. And according to a brief poll we did across both of our listening sessions, 14 out of our 21 participants reported that they felt that their data is not at all or only slightly protected. And moreover, there were 4 individuals out of the 21 that elaborated a bit more about their experience of being victims of identity theft, fraud, or recipients of the Biometric Information Privacy Act, or BIPA, settlements. And their experience, as they talked about it, made the concept of data privacy feel more immediate and personal rather than this abstract theory according, you know, to what we kind of hear in the story. They were able to put a face with these stories. So trust is earned, not assumed. There are a few factors that elicited trust amongst communities. And when we asked them what those things were, they said having transparency, security, accountability, consequences for executives and individuals and agencies or organizations across all levels, from local to the national, should be there should people's data be mishandled or used or misused. Banks and employers were the two primary entities that participants identified as being most trustworthy of handling their data, their personal identifying information, or PII, because they had stronger legal penalties and better safeguards in place to prevent data mishandling. However, there were notable factors, institutions, and scenarios in which community had significant sentiments around distrust, though. And this included a current administration's policy, practices, and decisions around how they access and share people's data with and between different agencies without people's consent. Large tech companies, social media platforms, and other agencies who sell data for targeted and unsolicited marketing and ads were identified as another source of distrust. Location and tracking devices. So again, those are the tolls, the health tech devices, so like the Ring that monitors and tracks your health, your heartbeats and mileage and all the how much steps you have, those things. The driving and speed monitoring apps that you get through your insurance were also identified as major concerns. And then third-party apps, such as Venmo and Cash App, these are the ones that were stated in the listening sessions, were seen as easily hackable and less secure than traditional online banking platforms. So what set of recommendations were derived from these two community listen sessions? We identified several, and I'll get into those momentarily. All right. The community-derived recommendations are surprisingly practical. These include wanting elected officials to think about the needs of their constituents and stand in their shoes and think legislatively from the mind frame of how they personally would want their own personal data and data privacy ensured and protected. They also wanted whistleblowers to be protected and not punished. Many participants wanted lawmakers to require companies and government agencies to clearly explain what data is being collected, why, how it will be used, and who it will be shared with in simple and easy to understand language that someone's grandmother could understand. Third, participants repeatedly stated that the current US laws are not keeping pace with the rapid use and incorporation of technology, AI, digital surveillance in in everyday life. And they called for new federal and state legislation that clearly defines and limits how this data is collected, shared, and the consequences for organizations, agencies, and companies that misuse it. Fourth, participants also referenced protections similar to HIPAA, FERPA, BIPA, and the European Union privacy regulations as examples of strong standards or stronger standards that should be mirrored and expanded across all sectors of how and where data is being collected in the US. These examples were viewed by many as offering clearer rules, better safeguards, and stronger accountability than many of the current US data privacy practices. Fifth recommendation, several participants emphasized that meaningful accountability requires more than promises and should include enforceable protection, independent audits conducted by independent panels or agencies that do not have a vested or political interest in the outcome, and punitive consequences for organizations, agencies, and companies that are found to be in violation of those. Many participants wanted the ability to sue and receive compensation or some form of settlement If an agency were found to be in violation of not protecting their data under the law, they suggested mandatory corrective actions, including hefty fines, the firing of company executives, and the closing of big and small companies who were repeat offenders or whose violation of people's data was found to be particularly egregious. Some participants wanted companies, agencies, and organizations to be required to document and then disclose publicly where their data was sold and shared, and to provide meaningful support um, beyond just free legal aid and resources for victims of breaches and identity theft. And then finally, a small subset of participants, particularly those who came in and noted that they had roles in their day-to-day lives as educators or as healthcare workers, they highlighted the need for greater community education campaigns, trainings, materials, and resources that will help communities, especially communities of color, and other vulnerable populations better understand their rights, the risks, and options of protecting their data. So what are some of the policy recommendations and call to actions for those of you on our call, our data leaders? All right. So for our actionable policy recommendations for legislators, for our local, state, and national policymakers and advisors, consider mandating that companies, government agencies, and technology platforms provide clear, concise, and standardized disclosure explaining what data is collected, why it's collected, how to be used, how long it will be retained, and with whom it will be shared. Consent processes should be written in plain language and include meaningful opt-in rather than opt-out mechanisms, and not have these lengthy legal agreements that ordinary people cannot understand. Um, enact um, enact stricter limits on the collection, use, and sharing and sale of sensitive personal information. This again includes people's biometric data, health, financial, immigration, location, demographic data, for example. Legislators should prohibit its use in ways that facilitate discrimination, profiling, surveillance, or disparate impacts on historically marginalized communities. And finally, establishing independent regulatory bodies or strengthening existing oversight authorities responsible for conducting regular audits of government agencies, technology companies, AI systems, and third-party companies that sell people's data. These regulatory bodies and oversight authorities should have the authority not only to investigate violations, but also impose and enforce meaningful penalties, corrective actions, and restitution for individuals harmed by data misuse or breaches. For our call to action for chief data officers, establish and have state level and national public fact-based and data-informed education campaigns, community training initiatives, ongoing engagement offerings that increase digital literacy, inform residents of their data rights, as this will help foster transparency and data access to citizens. Your organizations and agencies should also regularly conduct risk assessments of your data sharing policies and procedures and update them if needed to ensure that all employees, subcontractors, and vendors understand and are following best practice when it comes to ensuring security and or the transfer of people's data, if applicable. For our researchers and data stewards, so this is kind of my home. For our researchers and data stewards, your call to action is just as important and as vital as those of our policymakers and our chief data officers. This includes continuing to be on the ground and in community and in partnership with local organizations who are connected to the work, collaboratively working together to capture the varied perspectives of residents in your neighborhood and community, and the state to make sure that their lived experience and feedback are heard and included and kept in kind of top of mind in informing the work that you're doing. So I want to thank you again for this opportunity to present such to present to such a captive audience. And on the next slide, I kind of have a few questions for the audience before we open the floor to some questions, but I could also pause, Amy and Beth, to see if there are questions in the chat.
There are a couple questions in the chat. Can we knock those ones out first? Great.
Sure.
All right. Joe said, this is excellent information and really important as we talk about data collection. Was there any difference in responses when the data collection is mandatory, government collection, or required by law versus voluntary, required to get access to a product or service?
Repeat the first part of the question.
Was there a difference if the data collection was mandatory, like it's required by law, versus it is voluntary? I'm going to give this information to get a rebate or to get a better price at the store.
Yeah, so they kind of had the same expectation. If it's mandatory, they definitely wanted greater security, data privacy and security practices being followed and transparency. Things that were voluntary. So, for example, I go to CVS, I'm putting in my phone number, they know what I purchased, like they understand what is happening. They just want to have better understanding of okay, so now that CVS has, I'm not picking on CVS, but I'm giving this as an example. So I went there yesterday. Like, what happens to my data once I give that, right? Like all of a sudden, I know I'm now seeing ads on uh, social media or on my website for purchases of things that I may have Googled or on Amazon and things like that. So people are they see it, but they just want to know, like, well, what's happening? And if I want to opt out of that or not have that happen, how do I do that easily? Can there be a one-stop stop where I do this and not have to go to the CVS website, go to this website to opt out, go to this website to opt out? Like it makes it, that's what I think one of the findings was, like, it's more coercive than, they can't opt out meaningfully. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yep, thank you. And another question, could you tell from the issues people raised how much of their concerns might have been generated by specific Chicago events and how much is general? Knowing that this is qualitative, not quantitative, but is there anything that you learned that might be generalizable?
Sure. I think again, the disclaimer that I have is that although most of our participants were Black and women, um, they kind of are like the canary in the minefield. They sound the alarm because they are most directly impacted, or communities of color and their families are directly impacted first and foremost by policies. So I think although there are certain things that may be happening in Chicago, they're happening in other cities as well, right? And so I think a lot of our findings are generalizable, right? They want consent language that is easy to understand. They want the ability to protect their children and educate their children, like have some sort of educational training that's either done publicly through schools or through some other medium, to educate folks around their rights and things like that, right? So although they may be talking about an experience of a data privacy loss that happened in Chicago, the ripple effects and their suggestions are applicable to really anyone, because any one of us can be a victim of this, if that's helpful.
And speaking of anyone, another comment in the Q&A is that a lot of these same concerns are shared by conservative voters based on other focus groups. So.
Correct. And we did not ask, as part of our intake or our inclusion of folks in the focus group, what their political affiliation was. We didn't ask that question. So they could potentially represent, or likely did represent, different walks of life, different political perspectives and persuasions, and those sorts of things. So we did not specifically ask that because we didn't want that to be the center of the conversation. We were, if that's helpful.
Thank you. And now I'll hand it back to you for the Q&A that you have for the group.
Sure. So I have some questions, just to kind of facilitate the conversation with those of you on the webinar today. So I have three, and you can pick whichever one you want to engage in. And so one of the questions I have is which of these findings challenges assumptions you currently hold about how residents think about data privacy? Where do you see the largest gap between how data systems are designed and how communities actually experience them? Or what is one policy, process, or communication practice in your organization these findings make you want to revisit?
So I invite the audience to put your comments in the chat or in the Q&A.
Mhm.
Be great.
Amy, will you be reading them out loud? Because I can't quite see
I
which.
will. I would
Okay.
love to. I'm going to give people a couple more seconds to be thinking about this. While people are writing in their comments, I'm going to share what I'm thinking about the first one.
Mhm.
So for years, I worked at the Census Bureau, and we were getting administrative data to help improve census products, whether it's the frame or methods like imputation, doing linkages to generate new insights. And there wasn't really an opt out because the data were being used by the government for statistical purpose. And I always felt that we did kind of a lousy job telling people what statistical purpose was. We were able to say when census used the data, it wasn't going to be used for marketing or surveillance or enforcement because they were making sure that everything that was being published was you were unable to identify an individual in the data from it. Uh, but I hear your work, and I still think that we need to get people thinking about who has what data for what purpose and
Correct.
how they got it. Because some of these things, you're not going to opt out of tax filing. You're not going to opt out of getting Medicaid. Uh,
Mhm.
and so it's more transparency about the data.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we do have some folks in the chat now. Let's see. Someone said, I'd really like to revisit engaging community in the studies and surveys we design. Melissa, I would invite you. I don't know if people have looked at your website, but the BRC website is spectacular with the resources that you have. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So on the slide here, I have ways to connect with the BRC. We do trainings. We do offer toolkits that we actually just launched and posted on our website. These toolkits are around how to do community for our pillar one, our community action research, our community pitch process. So where a community comes to us, the BRC, with an issue or concern that they have, and we work with them to educate community around the issue, how to collect data around that. We find an anchor organization that they've recommended that they want to partner with. So right now we're working on the is it the south side, far south side of Chicago, on the quantum centers, the AI data centers. That's a one is coming or is being built there, and there's concerns around that in the community. And so we're going in, and we're educating them through our community action research projects on how to collect data from community, like empowering individuals to go in, collect data, whether that's interviews or focus groups or surveys around that issue, working with an anchor organization to help them build capacity. And they too are doing work in this. And so we connect community with an anchor org in that community on this issue. And so we are more like the facilitator of that training, of that education. And we then, the community, through the community action research projects, they may create a deliverable potentially to share back with policymakers like the aldermen and things or whoever they've identified around recommendations that the community has come up with around that issue. And we've done it around like food insecurity, mental health access, all sorts of different issues. So we have different resources and how to also conduct. Um, uh, we have a focus group toolkit, how to conduct focus groups or kind of a listening session in community. What does that look like? What does that entail? What should you take into consideration? And so we spell out that whole process for folks on that website, and it's a free tool and resource.
That is awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
Another observation based on your second question that you had up, the largest gap may be that we are in an opt-out rather than opt-in system, meaning that the burden is placed on the community to maintain data privacy, and oftentimes the system may intentionally make it difficult to figure out ways to maintain that privacy.
Yes. And that came up a lot in our listening sessions, that concern. Um, and we had a varying array of individuals that came from different backgrounds, education levels,
Mhm.
right? From high school graduates and GEDs to those with advanced degrees. We had people who were teachers and educators to stay-at-home moms and dads. Like it ran the gamut. Um, and, you know, those who worked with data on the daily, so like educators, folks in healthcare, nurses, doctors, those folks, they saw the need for and the importance for the training. I think that was one of the findings that I had in there. And so, one of the things, they didn't say this, but this was my recommendation. I'm going to age myself here. We used to have like the Schoolhouse Rock back in the day on PBS, where we learned about, conjunction junction and all those things. So thinking like, well, why could we not do something similar on educating people around data,
Mhm.
make it giving folks shorter attention span, short videos, or other ways to engage people in understanding without long reports. And if we are going to create reports and things like that, policymakers or legislators or anything, or community organizations, to make them short and accessible to
Mhm.
people to understand, right? Otherwise, nobody's going to read it. You
Right.
did all this work and no one will read it.
Yeah, that's another one of these comments is people, even really informed people, don't have a handle on how their data is used, both in the public and the private sectors. And then someone else pointed out that pertaining to question two, consent is a legal process which incentivizes corporations and governments to indemnify themselves legally and use that legalese that is intentionally confusing and prevents understanding to avoid lawsuits. And it's so frustrating because it's not designed for people and users, it's to protect profits and money and data holdings. And I think we should really consider how consent could be brought into a more people-friendly domain so it leans on the side of protecting people.
1000%.
Yeah.
1000%.
And another
Um,
observation, oops, sorry.
no, 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 go ahead.
Okay. Another observation, the second is top of mind because in many cases, systems are designed without understanding how communities are going to interact with them. So the gap is doing the difficult but necessary work to engage community to have data systems be community informed without the burden being on the community's time.
Exactly. Exactly.
And then there's another comment. I'm struck by how much the focus is on businesses and non-governmental data and the need to regulate it. I think we as policy advocates need to recognize that this data needs to be regulated, but also recognize data is usable as well by government agencies for potentially problematic uses. And I'm struck by how little the discussion was about the ways that this government is sharing data across agencies, such as Social Security data.
So that was something that did come up in the discussion, was the sharing of, or the unauthorized sharing of data across different agencies. With ICE, with like your travel information being shared with ICE, your or benefits being revoked because of your immigration status and things like that, things that were normally not done or perhaps codified in law. It was just a best practice or things that we just said you would not do. but because there was no written document stating that you couldn't do it, there are loopholes. And so people found loopholes, and here is where we are. And so that raised major, major concerns and flags in and across both focus groups. And so in our report, which we'll be sharing in our memo, I should say, of findings, we highlight some of these findings in that memo, which APDU will share, I think, within 48 hours or so after this webinar. So definitely feel free to read. And if there are additional questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk a bit more about the findings from the listening session or the memo.
I invite everybody to read it once we drop it, because it's one of those things you're reading and you're like, it's the sad, slow nod. Like, yep,
Mhm.
this is how people feel. And I am so excited to be working with you guys, because it isn't just that kind of moment of despair. It is, what are we going to do about it?
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
really that the optimism of moving forward through it. We've got
Yes.
another comment in here.
Mhm.
It's common knowledge, but my agency's Privacy Act statement should be more reader friendly, less legal language and more plain language that everyone can understand. How they use your data, how they collect it, why we share it. Everybody should know these things. The conversation encourages this person to look into the topic and see if they can change those statements. So,
Got it. And one of the things that I didn't say that we don't send to think about, like we tell our children about, like, oh, you post something online and it's there forever. But then one of the things that I'm thinking about as a researcher, and that we're required to do through our IRB and consent form, is how do we destroy data, right? And I know people are like, why would we destroy data? But like, if I've provided information as part of a research study, my health information, and my medical records to inform a cancer research study, if after that study is done, I may want my data deleted, even if it's de-identified, um, and not be repurposed for perpetuity, right? We think about like Henrietta Lacks and her cells, and the non-consent that was given, it was taken, and the millions of dollars that was made from her cells, right? So how do folks, if they've provided their data, if they want to not have it in a system, a data system or platform, if they wanted to do that, how can they easily do that as well and know that it's been done securely?
we have conversations about this pretty frequently, because if you have a data set and you're going to make a public good, like an open data set out of it, you do this severe de-identification, and it is that data set at that moment in time. And then if somebody in the data wanted to be forgotten, they wanted to have their record pulled, because we did a thorough de-identification, you can't do that anymore because you don't know which one it was. So I think that, to your earlier point about the schoolhouse rock sort of thing, it'd be great if we had ways for people to learn bits of this that layer, so you're building your knowledge about the way that data can be protected,
Mhm.
and what those protections actually do to the data. And it reduces the risk that you're going to have re-identification, but it also means you can't go back in there and do further scrubs. So,
Right. Right.
yeah. Any other questions for Melissa about this great work or the other work that they do? Please stick it in the chat. And while we're waiting for any final questions, I have another one.
Mhm.
You mentioned, what CDOs should do and legislators and that. What could policymakers and funders do?
Sure, it's a great question. I would say that, the call for action for policymakers is to listen before you legislate. People aren't necessarily saying that or asking us to stop using data. They're asking for meaningful transparency, choice, safeguards, and kind of real accountability. And I think that's the biggest part there. They're like, my data is already out here. They already have my data. How do we hold organizations, individuals, agencies accountable for misuse and mishandling, right? And that they should have a seat at the table. So policymakers should have a seat at the table while those protections are being designed. I'm sorry, people should have a seat at the table while those protections are being designed by lawmakers. For funders, they should fund the infrastructure that makes the seat at the table possible. Community engagement requires the engagement of trusted community partners, such as our community-based organizations, nonprofits, who are on the ground and invested in their community, and who are already kind of doing this work, doing the listening voices and doing the education and trainings of their community. But they should also be compensated, uh, so that this work can be sustained. Um, I guess another way to say it, more simply put, is that communities and the organizations rooted in them already know this terrain, right? They're living this experience day to day for the last however many 20 years that, or longer than that, the data has been collected, but even more so now. They have the knowledge, the relationships, and the ability to build the table. So we don't need to keep inviting them to the table that is being designed somewhere else. Funders can invest in the lumber and the tools that make that work possible for community, while policymakers should come to the table prepared to not just listen, but to share power and act on what they're hearing at the end of the day, right? Um, so go into community, hear what their needs are, and then legislate accordingly, but then fund the organizations, the community organizers to continue to do this work, to continue to develop the trainings, the resources, the materials, the translation into multiple languages other than English to reach different communities, that's on the ground work. And then legislate accordingly. And keep in mind, how would you want, if this was your personal data, how would you want it protected?
That is
But,
awesome.
mhm.
I have a final question for you. Is there anything that you would like participants to know that I haven't already asked?
Um, you are all very important and play a role in ensuring the data privacy and security of data now and in the future, and thinking longer term, as the rapid pace of AI, misinformation, disinformation, all that is out here, and being able to distinguish between reality and that is harder for folks based on what they're seeing, right, and reading.
Mhm.
So the job, I would say, is to just be transparent, hold your organization, yourself, and others that are doing this work accountable, and then like find a common language to speak to each other and make stuff accessible to the everyday person. Yeah,
That is fantastic. Melissa, I want to thank you for being with us today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. For
mhm.
anyone that wants to go back and rewatch or share this with their colleagues, a recording will be posted to APDU's YouTube channel. And if you'd like to see more events like this, please let us know by sending us an email at info@apdu.org. And if you're not already receiving our monthly newsletter to stay informed about things like this, please subscribe. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. Thanks.
All right.